Sidetrack episode 64, Words for Granted in the Bible. Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy and Agora Podcast Network member. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and I just recently set up a Facebook group called A to Z History Page. That'll have links and interesting conversation for both Beyond the Big Screen and the History of the Papacy, so I highly suggest you look it up and join. You can find links in the show notes and on the website a2zhistorypage.com to learn more. You can always send me an email at steve@a2zhistorypage.com. And I'd like to announce that we have new rewards for all levels of patronage on patreon.com/papacy. From this point forward, if you join the list of the History of the Papacy Diptychs, you will receive all episodes of the podcast early and completely ad-free. We have a collaboration episode today with Ray Belli of the Words for Granted podcast. Ray's podcast is about the history of words. Ray tells the fascinating story of words. He recently did a series about words in religion and specifically in Christianity and the Bible. In this episode, we talk about different sayings and idioms in the Old and New Testaments. We use many of these sayings on a day-to-day basis today. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode, and we would love to have your feedback. You can find links to Ray's show in the show notes or at wordsforgranted.com. I told you about some of the Patreon rewards, but if you go to patreon.com/papacy, you can find out about all the other benefits of becoming a History of the Papacy patron. Now, for the History of the Papacy patron diptychs, a huge shout-out goes to our Rome-level patrons, Peter the Great and Seth the Magnificent. I want to thank our Constantinople-level patrons, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, Sean, Yor, and Molly, Mary Carmen, and Dapo. Our Alexandria-level patrons are Francine, Richard, Justin, and Rupert. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Thank you, everybody, for listening today. We have a really special collaboration episode of two great podcasts. Of course, we have Ray Belli of the Words for Granted podcast, and I'm Steve, and I host the History of the Papacy podcast. And Ray and I came together on Facebook, I believe. Or no, you sent an email to me about exchanging introductions for our podcast, but then we got to talking and thinking that a collaboration episode could be in order because Ray has done an entire podcast series in his show, Words for Granted, about the language in the Bible. So I thought, let's talk about the Bible. And we together decided to talk about the Bible. So maybe we'll start out. Ray, why don't you tell us a little bit about your Words for Granted podcast?
Sure. Well, thanks for the introduction, Steve. Basically, Words for Granted is a podcast that looks at how words change over time. And it's not just about the Bible. I should make that clear to anyone who doesn't know about the show. I do thematic miniseries, and the most recent one that I wrapped up was about a biblical etymology. So, I basically chose like 9 or 10 words, and each episode focuses on the evolution of a single word and how the meaning changes over time. And it's basically the podcast is my way of using linguistics as a way of looking at change in the world, whether that's cultural change, historical change, religious changes. I have found almost accidentally that if you look at changes in words, you can track history in that way. So Words for Granted is not just a linguistics podcast or not just a history podcast, but kind of fusing both of those topics.
What are some other series you've done?
Oh, I did one on technology. I did one on Greek theater, days of the week. Right now, I'm about to do one on the evolution of grammar words. For a while, I was just doing. It was kind of a potpourri sort of thing, but the show naturally evolved into a mini series. So I think I've done maybe 6 or 7 of those in the last year.
What made you get into podcasting? What made you feel that a podcast would be a good thing to express what you're interested in?
Oh, that's actually a great question. I don't think I've ever talked about this on my show. Well, my interest in etymology actually happened completely accidentally and totally randomly, and many years before I started the podcast or I knew anything about linguistics proper. And funny enough, it actually has to do with the Bible. And I will tell you this true story. It sounds like something I'm making up, but I was at a friend's house, and I was in his bathroom, and on the back of the toilet seat, there was an art history book. And I was just flipping through it and going about my business, and there was a Renaissance painting of the Passion of the Christ. And I looked at the footnote, and it said Passios, the Latin word for passion, and it made a point of saying that this was the Latin word for suffering. And I just thought to myself, whoa, this word for passion, this word passion comes from a word for suffering. Like, what does that tell us about the way that we think or the way that we evolved? And then I just had this revelation that, oh my God, language changes over time. What other words have changed over time? And that was probably when I was around 18 or 19 years old. And it just turned into an obsession, like a soft obsession. You know, it was something that I would think about every now and then I'd go through like a 2 or 3 week phase where I was Googling the etymology of every word that popped into my head, and I was like, oh, I'd love to write a book about this or do a blog about this, but I'm nobody. I don't have a degree in this stuff, so who's going to listen to me? And then like 5 or 6 years later, I discovered podcasting and totally got addicted to podcasts. And I thought, you know what, this is a great medium for me to share this, my obsession with etymology. And I spent maybe 6 months, 8 months kind of honing the delivery and the style of the show. And then, yeah, Words for Granted was born. And it's been about 2 years now.
That's interesting. So I assume that's not your academic background, is not in linguistics then?
Well, my academic background is in literature, but of course that's very different than linguistics proper.
Yeah, I found that linguistics, like the study of it, it sucks the fun out of words oftentimes. I've taken a couple of linguistics classes, and my master's is in teaching, and they did a lot of linguistics. And like when you get into the nitty gritty of linguistics, you don't get to necessarily take the more fun routes, like with etymology and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. I've actually never taken a single proper linguistics course in my life. I've obsessively read linguistics textbooks on my own, but I think maybe because it was an autodidactic process for me, that I was still able to have fun with it. And I certainly don't know everything about linguistics, that's for sure. But I did have this affinity for etymology because I saw it as a form of storytelling. Like when I was actually writing about etymology, I didn't feel like I was doing something dry and academic. I was telling stories in a creative way, with beginnings, middles, and ends, but I was just using fact-based or historical linguistic-based information to construct the narrative, if that makes sense. What about you? I guess I should pass the ball back to you.
Well, my podcast, The History of the Papacy, I started it about 5 years ago. And it was really just a project. Like, I was reading all these books, and I've just kind of always dabbled a little bit in reading about church history. And just because I think, kind of like you said with the words, it's the breadth of it and the story. There's just so much there. And it was about a lot of the history podcasts were starting, and there really wasn't anything to follow on it. Like, there was obviously like the history of Rome, but you could really make up your own format. And I thought doing something really creative like that would be so much, just a lot of fun. And you're bringing in technology and, just a lot of different areas to tinker with. So I think podcasting allowed me to bring in a lot of my different interests and put them together, and not feel locked down into doing anything one particular way.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Like, if I didn't have this podcast, I would have no platform to talk about this stuff, and I certainly couldn't justify the amount of time reading on my own. I wouldn't be doing this amount of research just for myself. I mean, the part of the fun is that I get to share it with people, and over the last 2 years, I've acquired an audience, so it makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it, is the audience, and it's the feedback. Like, it's not just sitting in your room reading these books and then that's it. You're meeting people, like having conversations just like this, like people you likely never meet
right
in your day-to-day life. And you're getting to talk about these things with new people you meet, like you. And, presumably over the course of years, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people are going to hear this, and new conversations will develop off there. I think it's just an amazing way for people to get in contact with each other and share things they're really interested in.
Yeah, it sure is. I don't know if I mentioned this to you in the email, but I discovered your show through Gary Stevens' History of the Bible podcast. That was my introduction to you.
Oh, yeah. So it's like one thing leads to another. I mean, it's a guy in Australia, and then, next thing you know, it's a really cool thing.
Yeah. What was the podcast that kind of changed it? Like inspired you, if there is one in particular, to go and make your own?
I had been kicking around the idea of starting a podcast, but it was really Ray Harris of the History of World War II podcast. He was the one. I had contacted him over something, and he was actually the one who helped me with a lot of the technical background on it. And then he had me as a guest on his show, which was really terrifying because it was the first time I would ever set up a microphone or anything. But it was just a really, it was really cool that somebody like him was mentoring. And I feel like in podcasting, people are very helpful and quick to mentor other people.
Yeah, definitely. The podcast that kind of changed it for me was the History of English podcast. I don't know if you know that one.
Yeah.
I actually reached out to Kevin Stroud after I had only recorded maybe 3 episodes, and I really thanked him. I didn't even ask him to do a shout out of Words for Granted on the show. I was just so thankful. I was like, Kevin, thanks for your research. Thanks for your delivery. I was kind of going through a weird mental space at that time, but I had discovered this bizarro podcast that covered 2 of my favorite things, which were English and history, and just it really blew my mind. And I at the end of the email, I mentioned, hey, I'm starting my own podcast, Words for Granted. It's about etymology, but I'm trying to make it fun and engaging, and trying to use storytelling as the medium. And shortly after that, he mentioned it on his own show. And I know he actually listened to my show because he got the pronunciation of my last name right. He said Belli and not Belly, which is what most people say. And right out of the gates, my audience just appeared. Like I got thousands of followers the next day because Kevin just on one of his episodes he introduced my little humble show. So I'm really indebted to Kevin at least early on. My audience certainly just came over from his podcast.
What do you think? Was that one of the first podcasts you listened to, or were you into podcasts before that?
It was the third podcast that I'd listened to. First was Hardcore History. The second was Philosophize This by Stephen West. And the third one was History of English.
Yeah, there's just so many out there. I think that's the amazing part of it is almost anything you can think of, there is a podcast out there on it.
That's true.
Now, when we getting into the Bible, and that was one of your big series, what made you talked a little bit about it. What do you think was one specific thing that you learned in the Bible that was really interesting, or that was like an aha moment?
An aha moment. Well, I guess one of my main takeaways is a lot of the things aren't what they seem. Like once you start digging into the nitty gritty and looking at the language of the original texts, and you start taking historical linguistics into consideration, you realize that there's a lot more than meets the eye. Like, for example, I did an episode on the word demon, and I can't possibly do justice to the full evolution of demon, but basically it comes from a Greek word, daemon, which originally, maybe 500 years before Christianity even emerged, it referred to like lesser Greek deities, and then later on, it came to mean the souls of dead heroes from the Golden Age. And then Socrates said that the daemon is like your consciousness. It's the voice in your head telling you to do good or to do bad. And then Plato says daemons are actually imitations of the main pantheons of gods, because the gods are perfect. So when we read in Greek myths that the gods are actually doing naughty, disreputable things, those are the daemons doing them, because gods are perfect. So by the time we get to Christianity and the Greek authors are using this same word, daemon, in their own religious context, I mean, it has such a history of evolution. I mean, the word is just a word, but the word is like a portal into a cultural belief. It's just so loaded. So when we read the modern English word demon, we think of, or at least I think of, the little red guy with horns and a pitchfork and a forked tongue living in a world of flames. But that's almost certainly, actually, it's definitely not what the authors of the original authors of the New Testament meant when they were using that Greek word daemon.
Yeah, I think that's what's so cool, especially about something like the Bible. It's like one of those, like when they show the Grand Canyon and how all these different layers, you can't just take one layer out and understand it without all the context of everything else around it.
And most people don't do that. I mean, especially I shouldn't generalize, but I think most modern Christians, unless you're a scholar or an academic, that's not the route that most take.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into it with the King James version of the translation of the Bible, but translation is so fraught with pitfalls, and it's really one of the most difficult things academics can do, is translating one book from a book from one language to another.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only the difficulty is not only translating from one language to another, it's translating from one time period to another.
There was an interesting, I had learned about this book from Gary Stevens, actually. It's called The Orchard, and it's one of the most popular books in Israel right now. And the book is packed full of wordplay, Hebrew wordplay, and he interviewed the person who translated it into English, and to try and translate something that's really wordplay into a different language, it's almost impossible. But it's, that's the challenge in it.
Right. I think the thing that interests me most in translation are the things that we get wrong or the things that we misunderstand. Honestly, I'm more interested in the things that get lost in translation over time rather from language to language. Just because it's so odd in a way that the most popular book of all time and like one of like a holy text that millions upon millions of people read and believe in, it's ancient literature. It's no different than the Odyssey or the Iliad, or any other work. I mean, they're not exactly all from the same time period, but the same scholarly rigor that goes into translating those works goes into translating the Bible. And I just think a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, I was raised Protestant, and I mean, just based on my own mother's knowledge of the Bible or interest in the Bible, like none of what we're talking about, I'm sure, has ever crossed her mind. I mean, and no disrespect to her, it's just not her concern.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that, like you say, how things come in through time. When the King James Version was translated, when King James had his team translate the Bible in the early 1600s, was it? They were really working in a very specific context where so much of the thought of the theology of the Bible had changed. That affected the way that they were viewing the document that they were translating.
And the translation of the King James Bible is very politically fraught, and like nationalistically, if that's a word, nationalistically fraught, in that I think something like 90% of the lexicon of the English lexicon of the King James Bible is native Germanic words. Like, they tried to avoid using Latinate words as a way of showing English pride and Englishness. That's not exactly related to what you were saying, but again, just on this topic of
yeah, another piece of the pie.
Yeah, translations with agendas.
I think I learned this in your episode that the King James Version had built upon two previous translations that had occurred.
That's right.
One of them was about 100 years before, and one was maybe a little bit before that. The Tyndale and the Wycliffe Bible, I think they were.
Yeah, what is it? I think it's the Geneva Bible. With the Geneva Bible was the Bible of the Calvinists, and that one. Oh God, wait! I don't want to misspeak. Hold on. let me look at my notes. Sorry, one second. Yes. Okay. So the Calvinists had the Geneva Bible, which was the Tyndale Bible. I think Tyndale had died before he was able to complete a full translation, and some English expats had gone to Geneva and finished his translation there, hence the name. And then the Anglicans had the Bishop's Bible. So when the King James Version was translated, it was more like a revision and a fact-checking. It was a way of kind of taking what already existed and was familiar and perfecting it. I think something like only... It's like 15 or 20%, something like that, like a fairly low number, is actually original to the King James translation. The rest of it is basically a reworking or a direct lifting of these two other versions.
At that time in the early 1600s, wasn't English going through a really big change?
Yeah, I mean, it was. That was kind of the dawn of modern English. As we know it. I mean, it's very hard to put exact dates on these things. I mean, the exact dates don't matter, but Shakespeare and the King James Version are basically the two major works of what we call early modern English. And by that, it's not exactly the English that we speak today. Some of the syntax is a little... it's a little bit different. Some of the verb conjugations are different. Some of the pronouns are archaic. But basically, we can understand it. We can read Shakespeare maybe with some footnotes and totally get it, whereas we can't do that with Middle English. So just talk about like how odd this is. How many other works of literature are in an archaic version of our language that are still read today? I mean, it's basically Shakespeare and King James. That's it. Yeah. But yet for some people, the King James Version is the authoritative version of the Bible. But one of the main differences between English in the early 1600s and the English today is just word to word, like semantic change, like words develop different connotations. One of the best examples of this is the word meat. Do you know about the status of meat in King James?
I think so, but why don't you flesh it out a little?
No pun intended.
Yeah, no.
Well, actually, there wasn't a whole lot of flesh in the word meat in King James. That's the whole thing. Meat basically meant food. All food was called meat. And I don't know, I actually did an episode on this, but I don't remember the exact date or the exact time period at which the meaning of meat was restricted to animal flesh. But certainly in the King James Version, there's no usage of the word meat that implies exclusively animal flesh. And so there's some really weird passages, like there's something in Genesis where I believe God says, these herbs and vegetables and plants, they are meat unto you, talking about the vegetation in the Garden of Eden. And Jesus, apparently meat also was a word for like spiritual sustenance. So Jesus refers to himself as meat, which is really odd. So, I mean, that's just an example where, again, you can't take things at face value. But people still read the King James Version. Like I said, my own mother, according to her, that's the authoritative version of the Bible. But I don't know what she makes of the passage where Jesus calls himself meat, or God refers to vegetables and plants and herbs as meat.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Awkward phrasing, like the Psalm 23 is a famous one. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now there is that comma in there that says, that it's not all one clause, but it sure does sound like, if you're just listening to it, is that you're saying the Lord is my shepherd and I don't want him.
Yeah, sure.
But then when it's, then you look into it more, it's using want in the phrase that I shall not want, is that I'm not, that I don't need anything. And some of the other, there's a couple of Bible translations. I think it's the New International Version says, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. But that just doesn't sound as good either. That's a part of translation, especially when you're translating a literary document. You want it to sound good too.
Right, that's true. I mean, the Bible is not only a religious text, but also a poetic one.
And I think that that's got to be very difficult. And when you approach retranslating something, you don't want to translate it awkwardly and feel like you could be losing meaning too, even if the literal meaning is more closely to what people would understand.
Right. Well, the King James Version has this amazing irony about it, and it's that from a literary standpoint, it's pretty much agreed upon that it's a quote unquote beautiful and timeless work of English literature. But I believe as part of King James's guidelines that he wanted his translators to follow, they were to make as literal a translation as possible. So I don't know how they worked that one out. I don't think I've read any discussion of this topic, how they were commissioned to make something beautiful, but also as literal as possible. Because most translations aren't as literal as possible in order to, preserve some poetic integrity from language to language.
Now, do you know with the King James Version and the other versions that built on, were they translating from a Latin translation, or were they trying to use Hebrew and Greek texts, the original source documents, so to speak, to translate?
Right.
Into English.
I think they were using the original Greek and Hebrew. I'm fairly certain of that. Maybe in the previous versions, maybe some of the translators used Latin, and that was part of why the King James Version was important, in order to make sure that those translations from Latin were correct by kind of fact-checking them against the original sources. But I'm actually not 100% sure on that.
Because that also adds in a lot of complications. You're really relying on that the people who are doing the translating are experts in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, and that they are scholars in all of the historical context of how those words were used at that time. That's a lot to ask for a person living in 1600s England.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot at stake in theory. I mean, the difference between eternal salvation or damnation could depend upon the correct interpretation of a particular text. And I mean, what else do you have to go on other than the written word? I mean, this kind of gets at the heart of why I'm just so fascinated by this. By this, I mean biblical translations, because unlike the Odyssey or the Iliad, where we read that today and we understand that it's a work of someone's imagination, and these works represent people very different than we are today, with different values and views. We read it and then we're done. The Bible isn't like that. Christianity is a living religion, whereas Greek mythology and Roman mythology are not. No one is at home figuring out what the best way to worship Zeus is based on the interpretation of a text. But that is the case with Christianity.
That's another piece of the whole story, too, is that in the 1600s and then the 1500s, the focus of the Bible had changed dramatically. It changed from being the tool of teaching to a personal item that people used to teach themselves, really, with Martin Luther and Sola Scriptura. The older traditions of, like, say, the Roman Catholics or the Eastern Oriental Orthodox, they were the Bible. I mean, really, if you think about it, the Bible really wasn't locked down into the canonical version until I want to say, well, it happened in bits and pieces, kind of in the 300s, but like not really firmly locked down until many centuries later. So the early church thought that the canon was kind of a fluid thing, and they were still trying to figure it out, where once you get to Martin Luther, it becomes the inerrancy where the Bible has to be perfect. It's kind of a change in the mindset of how the people are approaching the text.
Yeah. That is not something that I've explored on my show, which perhaps I should. That definitely is something that could add some depth to the next time I do this, because I do plan to do the biblical etymology series round 2. There was just like way too much for me to cover. After like 4 months, I didn't want people to feel like it had turned into a Bible study podcast. So I think maybe at the beginning of next year, I'll be doing round 2.
Yeah, because that's almost a podcast, whole entire show in and of itself. But it might not be necessarily the one you want to do.
Yeah, if did the research, I'd love to do it. I mean, all of this is amazing to me.
One thing that I was wondering, and if it came up in your research, is especially from listening to like Kevin Stroud's History of English, English changed so dramatically at certain points, from Old English to Middle English to all these different influences. Did the influence of these biblical language that had come into the language, did that change throughout these different periods?
What exactly do you mean by the biblical language?
Like, did maybe like the idioms that are from the Bible, or did certain maybe idioms or how people perceived Bible and how they used it in their language change from Old English to Middle English, or when the French came to town?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure, but with regard to the idioms, as I was researching, because I guess we will get to that ultimately, which is what this podcast was originally supposed to be about, is biblical idioms. I guess that was supposed to be the real meat and potatoes of this. But a lot of the idioms that the internet claims originally come from the King James Bible actually don't. I would say that the King James Bible was the popularizer of a lot of these phrases. Like, for instance, apple of my eye, and oh gosh, there was another one. Oh, at my wit's end. You know, if you do like a quick etymological search, if you type in "at my wit's end" etymology, a not very academic site might say it's originally from the King James Bible. It appears there, but it actually first appears in Piers Plowman. So I think the King James Bible really solidified a lot of idioms that might have been forgotten over time. Like, at my wit's end is kind of an odd thing to say, at least in modern English. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, literally speaking. And if it had just appeared in Piers Plowman, it probably wouldn't still exist today. But because the King James Version took its cue from Piers Plowman, the King James Version kind of preserved that for all time.
Oh, so you're kind of saying that the translators were using sayings and idioms that were already in the use and applying
Sometimes,
them to
like, for
the
instance,
translation?
The apple of my eye is a English idiom that goes back all the way to King Alfred's writings. And let's see, I don't know exactly the passages in which apple of the eye appears, but I know it appears several times in the King James Version, and the Hebrew from which it's translated doesn't use the word for apple. It uses the word for the dark part of the eye, interestingly enough. But for whatever reason, English for a long time had used the term apple to refer to pupil. And so that's how that got translated. And again, if you do a quick search, apple of my eye etymology, maybe the internet will tell you it's from the King James Version, which it is, but it doesn't first appear there.
Oh, that's fascinating. Are there any idioms? What are some idioms that did start in these early English translations?
That is hard to say. I didn't do research on literally every single one. According to David Crystal, who did a much more academic and thorough survey of this exact topic and actually wrote a book about it, he says there are 257 idioms in the King James Bible that are part of Common English. And it's hard to say exactly which ones first appear there, or which ones are borrowed from previous or earlier writings. But I'm not sure that that's so important, because the main point is, if the King James Version weren't written, it's very likely that none of them would exist. I mean, the King James Version basically fossilized all of them. And do you think we should read a handful of these idioms so that our listeners know what we're talking about?
Yeah, definitely. Why don't you pick a couple of your favorites?
Okay. All things must come to pass. Ashes to ashes. Fight the good fight. Eye for an eye. Oh, there's an interesting one. Eye for an eye is not unique to the Bible. I mean, that was in Hammurabi's code, and that was like a common idiom in the ancient Near East. But I think the first the Western world's, certainly English's first exposure to that phrase was certainly through the Bible, but the Bible didn't invent it.
So in that case, that was using it in the literal sense, that it eye for an eye, but it's become in our modern usage something like just tit for tat or something like that.
Right.
You know, nobody's going to actually go and take somebody's eye out.
Yes, exactly. The haves and have-nots. That's an interesting one. How the mighty have fallen. Labor of love. Money is the root of all evil. Put the words in her mouth. Sour grapes. Sign of the times.
Yeah, I mean, you look at these, and even if they aren't, they weren't all invented or for the King James Version, these are all things that people probably use a dozen of these in a day.
No doubt. And what's odd is that in some of these, there's an archaic grammar that's preserved. Like, for instance, in the powers that be, that's a biblical quote. And the powers that be is not something that we would say is correct English. But that one comes from the Geneva Bible. And be was actually an alternative way of conjugating are in certain regions of England. So normally we would say the powers that are. But just because that was the way that was translated, it kind of stuck. And even today we say the powers that be, not the powers that are.
Do you know if anybody has done a research of how much of the King James Version is comprehensible to a modern English? Would you, like, if somebody were to just pick up the King James Version, what's the chances of them getting the full meaning out of that?
0.
Are they going to get like 80%?
I don't know. I don't think you can possibly read it and get its true meaning, if there is such a thing, without a lot of footnotes and a lot of your own research.
So kind of like Shakespeare in that way.
Yeah, definitely.
We didn't talk about this beforehand, but did it come up in any of your research about newer translations and how they work?
Yeah, well, newer translations, there's definitely a more rigorous, scholarly, academic sort of objective approach that has developed over time. For instance, let's see if I can think of an example off the top of my head. Like the King James Version kind of indiscriminately uses the word hell to describe anything that isn't heaven, that is with regard to the afterlife. But that word hell is translated from Hebrew words that could just mean grave, or as in gravestone or tomb, death, or even Hades, where there's not this implication of eternal torment and punishment, but just this other realm of death that isn't heaven. So whereas the King James Version just uses hell in all of these contexts, I know that newer versions that are trying to go for more accurate translations, they will, use the word for death or grave, or they even use Hades.
There's an interesting one too that I came across in the Our Father. There's give us this day our daily bread, and that translation of daily bread, it doesn't really capture anything of what the Greek term was. The Greek term was epiousios, which was a word that the Bible writer invented. What do they call that? I think that has like a fancy name, neologism or something.
Neologism.
Yes. And so translating that word, you really can't translate it with like one word. It's kind of encapsulating like a whole concept that just doesn't easily get translated into one or two English words. And I think that's not the only one.
Do you know exactly what that word meant or implied?
It implied the communion, really, that you're not just eating a small slice of bread, or it's actually almost the exact opposite connotation you'd think you'd get with daily bread. Like you're just eating your regular food. You're eating like the super food, the food like of the the religious food, the God food. You're not just eating your daily food.
Yeah.
So that translation kind of that translation loses what they were going for.
Give us this day our daily ambrosia. It might have been.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but how ridiculous is that when you think about it? That's a term from a pagan religion, and it's like, to my mind, that would almost verge on heresy to even like include that. You see what I'm saying? How difficult this stuff is? But
yeah,
culturally, we know what ambrosia means, but of course, it's not the same ambrosia that the Greeks would use, but it's some idea of holy food that we don't have a word for.
And if you're using something, you almost have to think ahead. That is the context going to change on how we view a certain word? And is that going to change what we fundamentally think about this concept that we're trying to explain?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes. And looking at the evolution of the word demon, I think that's a perfect example of how that word has indeed changed by its adaptation to a new context.
Yeah, that's just fascinating, and that's got to happen all the time in language.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it certainly does, especially with religious concepts. Another example, we don't have to go too deep into it, but another example is the word weird, which is a concept that's kind of like fate and destiny, that was native to the Anglo-Saxon pagan religion. But it doesn't exactly mean fate or destiny, and it has a whole complicated philosophy and system of thought behind it that when translators were when English translators were using that word weird to translate the Greek and Latin ideas of fate, it just doesn't quite get it. They're fundamentally different concepts.
Yeah, that is just fascinating. It's so many pitfalls for the translator and for the people who are reading the text.
Right, and of course, I mean, nowadays weird just means strange, so it's evolved even more. But that's a major digression. I don't think we need to pursue that. But I think it proves your point.
What do you think, if you were to revisit this topic, what do you think the thing was that you would like to dive into more?
Well, I mean, since we opened up this this treasure trove of idioms, I think looking at some of these in much greater detail, like episode length detail, might be really interesting. And also maybe looking at some biblical coinages, such as scapegoat. That is an original one to the Bible. Do you know, or should I share the story of the scapegoat?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So it literally means a scapegoat, as in the verb to escape. But apparently scape was another way of saying escape. Like some people just dropped the initial E, and that was conventional up until the 1700s. So the scapegoat first appears in Leviticus. I have this here, Leviticus 16:6, and the quote is, "Aaron shall cast lots upon the two goats, one for the Lord, one for the scapegoat." And the idea was that a scapegoat would be ritually burdened with the sins of man and then driven away. But the Hebrew word for this a scapegoat is azazel, which some linguists have linked to a Hebrew stem, which means to remove, which is how the translators of the Septuagint rendered it. I don't know what the Greek word is, but it means the sender away of sins. But modern linguists aren't all in agreement about what that Hebrew stem definitively means. That's just the consensus. But what I find odd is that Azazel is also the name of a demon. And I don't know anything about that. Maybe did you have any insight into Azazel the demon?
No, I never heard of that. Or if I did, I don't have anything intelligent to say about
bizarre
it.
Is that I actually have heard of Azazel because it's the antagonist in a 90s Denzel Washington movie called Fallen, where he's like,
that's where
totally
I heard
weird.
of it.
I really liked that movie when I was younger, and I haven't seen it in probably like 15 years. But Azazel was the demon, and then I pursued this just a little bit, and they're the same thing. So here's an example of where, as the King James Version translates Azazel as scapegoat, some of the more scholarly modern translations of the Bible just keep the word as Azazel. But that's not really helpful, because that means that the goat's name is a demon? Is the goat a demon? Like what's the deal? I have no idea. It's really weird.
Yeah, that's strange. Another one that I've always been confused about, and you hear a lot of different things, is in the Old Testament. I can't think of I think it was in the book of Isaiah where they said virgin, and that's how it's translated into our into the New King James Version. And that's like Christians use that as a precursor to the Virgin Mary. But in Hebrew, it doesn't necessarily, the word that they used in Hebrew doesn't necessarily mean virgin, but the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament done in Egypt in, I think, the 100s-ish BC translates it into a Greek word that clearly means virgin. So you have it's so complicated, you don't know what's what. Why would they translate it in this? Did they not have the vocabulary in Greek to express that? Was there a context that they had back then that we don't have now? It's like, you're stepping into quicksand and you sink above your head.
Right. Wait, I think that the Hebrew word kind of doubled for young woman and virgin. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I think so. And it could have it was young woman, which was almost synonymous with virgin at that time.
Right. Exactly. I guess that's I guess that's why we'll never know exactly what it meant.
Yeah. And there's just so much of that how language was used 2,500 years ago, and we're trying to pick apart, well, what did they actually mean there? It's an impossible thing.
And like I said earlier, it matters much more in a sense, in terms of literally the way people choose to live their lives on theological principles. It matters a lot more than if we had these same problems in the Odyssey or the Iliad. Again, just to go back to these two other ancient works, because nothing's at stake in people's theological lives, in people's religious lives with these works today. But quite the opposite is true with Christianity.
I wonder, I have to imagine that even today, somebody writing a book, it's going to get reinterpreted in different ways. And I wonder if there is a way to fossilize what people are thinking at one point in time. I mean, in a way, it would be cool if you could do that, but in another way, it's almost impossible to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the linguistics consensus is that it is impossible, and we kind of have an illusion or a delusion about the written word. It seems very it seems very static and unchanging. It's there in front of us on the page. We look in a dictionary, and the dictionary says it means this, that, or that. But that's just not how it works. That words change, plain and simple. Time changes them. Context changes them.
To wrap up this conversation, what are some other aspects of etymology that really excite you, or something that you're looking to do more research on?
I have a few mini-series lined up in my mind. I don't know if I'll actually get to do them because I change my mind all the time, but at least what I have on the back burner is place names. And that's fascinating because, well, when an outsider, when an ethnic outsider gives a name to a particular community or ethnic group or state, it's not necessarily what that ethnic community wants to be called, and the word can fossilize some power dynamics. For example, that's one aspect of how place names are interesting, or ethnic names. Another thing that I want to do is early American English. Words from Greek philosophy. I mean, it's endless. The topics are just so vast, and like I said, words are just my way of looking at history without getting locked into a certain time period. Language is the theme, so that's it. It's all fair game, and I'm really excited to keep doing this for as long as I can. Just looking at cool stories and things that have changed. I'm really just obsessed with things that have changed and what we don't understand and we think we understand. See, that's the caveat. What we don't understand, but we think we do.
Now that we've got just a little taste of your show, and I know people are going to want to go listen to it, how can they learn more about your show, subscribe, and listen to it?
Sure. Well, you can just go to wordsforgranted.com and download the episodes or subscribe from there. I'm on all of the major podcasting directories. And what about you, for my listeners?
Well, my show, I have two shows, the History of the Papacy podcast, which is like we said, along the way, the papacy is one part of it, but I'm also talking about things like this, like the Bible and early Christian history, and how I've always wanted to look at how all the pieces fit together. And my other podcast really has nothing to do with Christianity or history at all. It's called Beyond the Big Screen, where I interview guests about a movie and really look at not just whether the movie is historically accurate or not, or if they had, somebody wore 3 buttons on their coat instead of 5. We're trying to look at the bigger picture and why certain things happen in the movie and how that relates to not only history, but also politics and government and religion. And so it's a fun show, and that's called Beyond the Big Screen. You can find both of those at all the usual podcatchers, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, but also at my website, which is A2Z History page. You can learn about both of them.
Yeah, I have not checked out Beyond the Big Screen, really just the History of the Papacy podcast, which I am working my way through. Unlike the Words for Granted podcast, you have a far greater back catalog just by virtue of time. So I'm like, I may be 40 episodes in from the beginning. So yeah, I've got a ways to go.
What's the nice thing about the Beyond the Big Screen is they're not, it's not a series. I do have short series in there of 1, maybe 2, 3 episodes. I think 3 is the most right now, but you can pick and choose which movie. The biggest series was on the movie Blade Runner, which was 5 episodes long. There was a lot to talk about with Blade Runner, believe it or not.
Oh yeah, I love Blade Runner.
Oh, you should definitely listen to that episode. There was the guest I interviewed. He's a political scientist, but he's also obsessed with Blade Runner, and it's unbelievable. We talked about the first movie, the 3 mini episodes between the first movie and then the one that was just released about a year ago, and then the new movie, Blade Runner 2048. It was a really cool series of episodes.
Yeah, that sounds great. Have you seen that new movie about Paul? I got this ad. I had no idea that this existed. I didn't see any advertising for it or anything, but I got this ad while I was doing my biblical research, and there's a Paul movie out. What's the deal with that?
I noticed that movie, and then I think I saw it as like a Facebook ad or a Twitter ad or something, and I think there's not too many big name actors in there. There's only maybe one big name actor, and I was meaning to watch it, and then I actually completely forgot about it. But it seems like that's a popular genre these days where they put these movies out. There was the Samson movie that came out maybe about 6 months ago, and it was not a great movie. But I think there's kind of a mill that puts these movies out. I think that Paul one seemed I did do a little bit of reading about it, and it seems like it's a fairly accurate movie, and it's kind of religious-y. I mean, I guess you can't avoid that it's religious movie about Paul, but some of the other ones, like there was one with Ray Fiennes, I think, and he plays the soldier who actually crucified Jesus, and I fell asleep in that movie, I think about 5 minutes into it. It was able to keep my attention span for about 5 minutes.
Am I right in saying that Jim Caviezel was in the Paul movie?
Yeah, I was saying that there's got to be something in the contract that you can't double dip like that. How can you be Jesus and another character? Isn't there? There's got to be something in the Hollywood bylaws about that.
Yeah, Jim Caviezel, for those who might not know, played Jesus in the Passion of the Christ.
Yeah, that's
who does he play?
I believe he plays. Who does he? One of like the lesser known characters, like not the. He wasn't Paul. I don't think Paul was a major actor. He played like Andrew or something like that. So I don't know how big of a role he had. I think it's possible that he was just in there enough to put his name on the marquee.
Sure.
But I think there's a big, definitely a genre of that, where the type of movie where they put them out, and they're maybe not always of the best quality. Well, I had a great time talking to you, and I think we'll definitely have to do this again at some point.
Yeah, I would love to, Steve. Thanks for having me.